On August 5, 2025, the Supreme Court delivered a historic ruling, striking down the Trump administration's sweeping tariffs that had been imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. This decision marked a pivotal moment in the ongoing debate over the reach of presidential authority, especially when it comes to shaping the nation's trade policy. The case had wound its way through the courts for years, drawing intense scrutiny from legal scholars, business leaders, and policymakers alike. At its core, the legal battle was about more than just tariffs. It was about the fundamental question of who holds the power to make decisions that impact the U.S. economy and its relationships with trading partners around the world. The central issue before the court was whether a president could invoke emergency powers to unilaterally reshape long-term economic policy. After hearing arguments from both sides, the justices issued a clear and decisive answer. No, the president cannot use emergency powers as a backdoor to bypass Congress and implement broad, lasting changes to trade policy. Businesses and trade groups had long argued that the IEEPA was designed for targeted sanctions against specific hostile actors or threats, not for imposing broad tariffs that affect entire industries and trading partners. They warned that allowing such use of emergency powers would set a dangerous precedent, giving the executive branch unchecked authority over the economy. The Supreme Court agreed with these arguments, ruling that the Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the exclusive power to regulate foreign commerce and levy duties. The justices emphasized that while the President has important national security responsibilities, those powers do not extend to fundamentally altering trade policy without congressional approval. The administration had defended the tariffs as necessary to protect national security and American jobs, arguing that global economic threats required swift executive action. However, opponents countered that such actions undermined the balance of power and risked eroding democratic checks and balances. Ultimately, the court's decision was about more than just tariffs. It was a powerful statement on the architecture of American governance, reinforcing the separation of powers and the vital role of Congress in shaping the nation's economic future. The fallout from this ruling will have far-reaching consequences, redefining how future administrations approach trade, executive authority, and the use of emergency powers. Businesses, lawmakers, and foreign governments are now reassessing their strategies in light of this new legal landscape. As the dust settles, one thing is clear: the debate over trade, executive power, and national security has entered a new era, one where the boundaries of presidential authority are more sharply defined, and the role of Congress in economic policy is reaffirmed for generations to come. The United States Constitution is clear. It grants Congress, not the President, the explicit authority to regulate foreign commerce. This foundational principle is rooted in the Commerce Clause, which was designed to ensure that the power to shape the nation's trade policy would rest with the legislative branch, reflecting the will of the people through their elected representatives. In the early years of the Republic, Congress exercised this power directly, crafting and enacting trade laws that shaped America's economic relationships with the world. However, as global trade became more complex and fast-moving, Congress began to delegate some of its authority to the executive branch, allowing the president to act swiftly in certain situations. This delegation was intended to provide flexibility, but always within limits set by Congress itself. Key laws like the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974 gave presidents specific, limited powers to adjust tariffs or negotiate agreements. Yet, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, was crafted for national security emergencies, not as a tool for broad economic or trade policy. Its use was meant to be rare and targeted, not a substitute for congressional action. When the Trump administration invoked IEEPA to impose sweeping trade restrictions, it marked a dramatic departure from established practice. For the first time, an emergency law was being used to reshape trade policy, raising serious questions about the separation of powers and the proper roles of Congress and the President. In court, plaintiffs argued that while Congress can delegate some authority to the executive, it cannot hand over its core legislative responsibilities, especially those as significant as regulating international commerce. They contended that such a move would undermine the checks and balances at the heart of the Constitution. The judiciary was faced with a crucial question. Where's the boundary between legitimate executive action and unconstitutional overreach? The courts had to weigh the need for executive flexibility against the fundamental requirement that Congress retain control over major policy decisions. Ultimately, the Supreme Court's ruling made it clear that only Congress has the authority to make sweeping changes to trade policy. The decision reaffirmed that emergency powers cannot be used as a backdoor for the executive to bypass the legislative process. This landmark decision reasserts the legislative branch's primary and indispensable role in shaping America's international commerce. It sends a strong message that the balance of power must be preserved and that Congress remains the central actor in trade matters. With this ruling, the balance of power in trade policy is now firmly back in Congress's hands, ensuring that the voices of the American people, through their representatives, guide the nation's economic future. The IEEPA, passed in 1977, was designed for targeted sanctions against foreign threats, not for setting broad trade policy. The Trump administration declared trade imbalances a national emergency, using IEEPA to impose tariffs worldwide. Critics argued this was a misuse of emergency powers, far beyond Congress's intent. The legal challenge focused on whether IEEPA's language truly authorized such sweeping action. The Supreme Court's narrow reading of IEEPA closes the door on using emergency powers for broad economic policy. Emergency powers are not a blank check for the president to bypass Congress on trade. The Major Questions Doctrine played a central role in the court's decision. This doctrine says that for issues of vast economic significance, Congress must give clear, explicit authorization. The court found that imposing tariffs on hundreds of billions in goods was a major question. The IEEPA lacked the clear language needed for such a sweeping move. The ruling affirms that only Congress can authorize transformative economic policies. The Major Questions Doctrine now stands as a key check on executive power. The decision sends a message: sweeping policy changes require a clear mandate from Congress. The balance of power is reinforced, no more finding new powers in vague statutes. The legal battle began in the Court of International Trade, a specialized federal court that handles cases involving international trade and customs laws. Here, a coalition of businesses, importers, and trade associations came together to challenge the administration's newly imposed tariffs. They argued that these tariffs were unlawful, claiming the president had overstepped his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. The courtroom was filled with tension as lawyers presented their arguments, emphasizing the potential economic harm and the importance of adhering to the rule of law. After careful consideration, the lower court sided with the challengers, agreeing that the administration's actions exceeded the limits set by Congress. However, the government was not willing to accept defeat. The administration quickly appealed the decision to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, a higher court with the power to overturn lower court rulings. In a surprising turn, the Federal Circuit reversed the decision, siding with the administration and upholding the tariffs. This back and forth created a legal conflict, and the case's national significance made Supreme Court review all but inevitable. The stakes were high, as the outcome would determine the balance of power between the executive branch and Congress in matters of trade and emergency powers. When the case reached the Supreme Court, the justices listened intently as both sides presented their arguments. They grilled the attorneys on the precise limits of IEEPA and questioned how much authority the president should have to act unilaterally in the name of national security or economic emergency. Their probing questions revealed deep concerns about the potential for unchecked presidential authority. The justices debated whether allowing such broad powers could undermine the constitutional system of checks and balances, and whether Congress's intent was being respected. Ultimately, after much deliberation, the Supreme Court issued a landmark decision. The justices reversed the Federal Circuit's ruling, declaring that the tariffs exceeded the statutory authority granted by Congress under IEEPA. This decision sent a clear message about the limits of executive power. The ruling sets a powerful precedent. The president cannot use emergency powers as a way to bypass Congress on critical issues like trade policy. It reaffirms the vital role of legislative oversight in safeguarding democratic principles. With this decision, the legal odyssey comes to an end, establishing a firm check on executive overreach and reinforcing the balance of power at the heart of the American constitutional system. The legal uncertainty over the tariffs created chaos for businesses and markets. Companies struggled to plan, facing higher costs and unpredictable rules. Manufacturers, farmers, and retailers all felt the pain. Higher prices, lost markets, and supply chain disruptions. Financial markets swung with every legal development, reflecting the stakes. The Supreme Court's decision brings long-awaited clarity, but unwinding years of adjustments will take time. The episode shows how legal battles at the top can ripple through the entire economy. With the ruling, businesses can finally plan for the future. The lesson: stable, predictable trade policy is essential for prosperity. The Trump administration argued the tariffs were vital for national security and economic defense. They claimed IEEPA's broad language gave the president flexibility to act against evolving threats. The administration cited historical precedent for executive power in trade. They warned that limiting the president would weaken America's ability to respond to crises. But the Supreme Court prioritized constitutional checks and balances over executive discretion. The defense of broad executive power ultimately failed at the highest court. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled the Trump administration's use of IEEPA for broad tariffs was executive overreach. The majority, citing the major questions doctrine, found no clear congressional authorization for such sweeping action. The court emphasized IEEPA was meant for targeted sanctions, not rewriting trade law. The power to regulate commerce remains with Congress. The ruling doesn't eliminate emergency powers, but clarifies their limits. Dissenters warned the decision could hamper future presidents, but the majority set a firm precedent. The law is now clear. Major trade policy changes require explicit congressional approval. The decision marks a new era for the separation of powers in trade. The Supreme Court's decision immediately invalidates the tariffs, offering relief to businesses and consumers. Companies must now adjust to a new, tariff-free landscape. The ruling redraws the boundaries of executive authority and economic policy. Future presidents will need Congress to enact major trade measures. The decision strengthens checks and balances, making unilateral action harder. Legal and political battles may now shift to other trade statutes. Congress may revisit the powers it has delegated to the executive. The nation faces a new challenge, balancing swift action with constitutional limits in a complex world.